All right, welcome back for the third part of One Man's Faith. We're talking about the covenant now between Jonathan and David. And we're going to look at that. We're going to make a comparison here in just a minute. But Jonathan and David made a covenant. Now, David gets run out of the kingdom, all right? Saul was out to get him. Saul was afraid of him. Saul knew that he was going to take over the kingdom. And that's not what David was about. David said, no, he's the Lord's anointed. Do not hurt him. But he and Jonathan split. They still had their covenant. But David had to leave. And so David was gone for many years, not seeing Jonathan. Now, at the end of Samuel, in 1 Samuel chapter 31, it says, now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. And the battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded. And Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and pierce me, lest these uncircumcised, there's that word, for not having covenant, uncircumcised Philistines come and pierce me through and make sport of me. But his armor bearer would not, for he had greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. And when the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. He didn't run. That's a loyal man. He said, my king is dead. I'm not going to run. I'm just going to fall on my sword and die with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men were on that day. So Saul's dead, Jonathan and his 3 sons are dead. In essence, the kingdom is left open, so to speak. Now, if they had any sons, they would be the next in line. Okay, so in 2 Samuel, turn over one page to 2 Samuel chapter 1. Said, now after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days at Ziklag, and it happened on the 3rd day that, behold, a man came from the camp of Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And it came about that when he came to David, that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, from where have you come? And he said, I've escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did things go? Please tell me. And he said, the people have fled in battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. So David said to the young man, how do you know that they're dead? And the young man said to him, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. Now if you go down to verse 11, and then David took hold of his clothes and he tore them. And so also did the men who were with him, and they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan. See, David was true to this king, even though this king was out to get him. He always called him God's anointed, because God did. God anointed him to be king. And so David wasn't going to raise a hand against him. But also in this mix is Jonathan. And now Jonathan is dead. Well, after this, David is made king over Judah, and Ishbosheth is made king over Israel. In a sense, the kingdoms were kind of split there for about 7 years, 7.5 years. David was king over Judah, and Ishbosheth was king over Israel, and there was a civil war between them. After 7.5 years, things come back together again. And in 2 Samuel chapter 8, down in verse 15, and so David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all the people. So David finally, after 7.5 years of civil war, became king over the entire nation. And at that time, it must have hit David. Well, I wonder if what about Jonathan? And so in chapter 9, it says, and David said, is there yet anyone left in the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? See, Jonathan's family is now David's family because Jonathan and David have a covenant. So he says, is there anyone left in Saul's family that I may show him kindness? Now there was a servant, verse 2, from the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said, is there yet anyone in the house of Saul with whom I can show kindness of God? And Ziba, and by the way, the word kindness there, that we've just read, even earlier it says, let anyone in the house of Saul that I might show chesed. It's the covenant mercy, the covenant kindness. And that's what he's talking about here. It's not just show kindness. It's chesed because of the covenant he had. And so in verse 3, and Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. See, David didn't even know this, who is crippled in both feet. So the king said to him, where is he? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he's at the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar. And King David sent and brought from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. So there's a son of Jonathan's. That means that the covenant now, the kindness that David wants to show can be shown to even more deeply into Jonathan's life because of Jonathan and the covenant that they had. And so he said, there's a son? Go get him quick. Now, the only other thing we know about Mephibosheth is in chapter 4. Let's see, verse 4. It said, now Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Jonathan and Saul came from Jezreel, and in other words, the fact that they were dead. And so his nurse took him up and fled, and it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Okay, so when a king dies, the whole family is up for grabs, and depending on who's going to come in and take kingship, normally they killed off the whole family so that there were no legitimate contestants for the kingship. And so they were all fleeing, and in that fleeing, this 5-year-old boy somehow became lame. Whether someone fell on him or he got thrown down, it doesn't tell us. But Mephibosheth becomes lame. Now after that, David becomes king. And it's all blamed on David. It's all blamed on David. We'll eventually see that because Mephibosheth actually turns away from David because he still blames David for his father's death. Mephibosheth doesn't know anything about the covenant that those two had. And so he brings Mephibosheth in to his palace or whatever it was he was at. And in verse 6, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he said, here's your servant. Because he still thought that he could even be, this is a legitimate heir to the throne, that David was going to kill him. And David said to him in verse 7, "Do not fear, for I will surely show chesed to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly." And again Mephibosheth prostrated himself and said, "What is your servant that you would regard a dead dog like me?" There's no understanding. Mephibosheth did not know about this covenant. But Saul is saying, listen, David's saying, listen, what I have is yours. You will eat with me regularly. You're one of my sons. And Mephibosheth just cannot grasp hold of this thing. He says, what I have is yours. You will eat with me. Here, I'm going to give you back the land that was your father's. Actually, your grandfather's, Saul's. And he set up Ziba and his children to till the land and make it produce, to in a sense make money for Mephibosheth. I can't even say that name, Mephibosheth. Because of this covenant. Because of this covenant. You know, here we have now two men. They made covenant a long time ago, probably 25 years ago. David had to leave the area because of Saul's ranting and raving, because God had departed from him. And David has to endure the constant attacks from Saul, as Saul tried to find him wherever David ran to. David finally had to end up going and living with the Philistines, the uncircumcised dogs, and working in a sense for them, just to get away from Saul, because Saul would not go into Philistine country. And yet there's this covenant, and David tries to make right with it, because it's never ending. All right, got to take our last break, so let's take our break, get that cup of coffee, and I'll be right back.